Hello and welcome to the Follow in Truth live biblical teach on YouTube. I'm your host, LJ. If you are new here, welcome. Please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. It does help with the YouTube analytics somehow. I have no idea, but it would be much appreciated if you could do that. You can follow me on my website, www.followintruth.com. You can also purchase my books through Amazon. There is a link in the description below to my website, which will take you through to Amazon, or you can just search for LJ Threepland on Amazon for those two books. They are Is God Moral? A Biblical Analyst, and also the Holy Bible versus the Hebrew Israelites. So there's two books there available. They're available on paperback and on ebook for download. Okay, so in this video, we're going to do part 2 of Is New Testament Tithing Biblical? In part 1, we looked at basically what a tithe was, and then we looked at some of the verses that revolved around the tithe in the Old Testament. Today we're going to look at more in the New Testament and what the New Testament actually teaches about tithing. Interestingly, many advocates of the New Testament tithe still have to go back to the Old Testament when trying to prove tithing, even when they will agree that New Testament tithing is not part of the Old Testament law. So even when they don't appeal to the law the law of Moses, where tithing was part of Israel, they still have to go back to the Old Testament in order to demonstrate that the New Testament tithe still is part of Christianity, and it is something that a Christian, a New Testament believer, is supposed to do. So basically what they do is that they acknowledge that the law that was given in the Old Testament through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all that we looked at in the last video, that we're no longer under any of that law, but they still want to say that tithing is part of the New Testament. So in order to do that, what they actually do is they go pre-law and they go back to Abraham, and they will say that Abraham tithed before the law. And so if Abraham was obligated to pay tithes then before the law, then we are still obligated to pay tithes now, even though the law, we're no longer under the law, because tithing did not end with the law. Tithing was introduced before the law. So that's the rationale there. And the story of Abraham and his tithe is found in Genesis chapter 14, where Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek. And Genesis 14:20, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hand, and he gave him tithes of all. Now, many will point out they'll point to the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, that and particularly chapter 7, in order to support the pre-law tithe of Abraham. Many will state that in the same way that Abraham gave a tithe pre-law, the New Testament believers must give a post-law tithe to men on earth, which is received by Jesus, who is our high priest in heaven, after the order of Melchizedek. And they'll go to Hebrews 7:1. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Now, consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. And verily, they that are of the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they came out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham and blessed him, and had the promises. And without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. And here men that die receive tithes, but there he receiveth them, of whom it is witnessed that he liveth, and as I may so say, Levi also, who receiveth tithes, paid tithes in Abraham, for he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Okay, so this is a complicated little passage there, but it would seem that Abraham paid a tithe to Melchizedek because Melchizedek was the king of righteousness, the king of Salem, and Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And Levi, the Levites who were in the loins of Abraham, meaning that they had not yet come to fruition through Abraham and his seed. They paid tithes through Abraham. Basically, obviously they didn't exist, but it's metaphorical. It's not literal that they paid. It's how Abraham, their father, paid tithes to Melchizedek. And so we should pay tithes to Jesus because he is of the order of Melchizedek. And we pay those through, as it said, through men receive the tithes on earth, but he receives them where he is. So we give to men on earth, the priests, or whoever it is, that your preacher that is telling you that you have to give a tithe. And when we give those tithes to the preacher, it's Jesus that receives them. Now, I don't know if you've seen some of the houses that some of these preachers have. It's sure not going to Jesus. But that's another story. When we actually examine Hebrews 7, however, it's got nothing at all to do with teaching tithing. The tithe is used only as an example to demonstrate the superiority of the priesthood of Jesus over that of the Levitical priesthood. The whole book of Hebrews is written to the Hebrews. It's not written to the Gentiles. It's the book of the Hebrews written to the Hebrews. The Hebrews are the ones that came from Abraham. Uh, so, in this sense, it's the Hebrew Israelites, the basically Israel. We won't go into the difference between Hebrew Ishmaelites and all the different Hebrews, but the Israelites who came from Abraham. Uh, Basically, what's happening here is that it's teaching that Jesus's priesthood is uh, is a superior priesthood to that of the Levitical priesthood that was on earth. The chapter starts by going back and telling that Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14, as we've already read. But in Hebrews 7, it says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all. First being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace." And it is verse 3 that is often used by many to say that that Melchizedek was actually the pre-incarnate Jesus. Now, that is a completely different study and a completely different false doctrine, but there are so many people out there that preach that Melchizedek is literally Jesus Christ and Jesus, the pre-incarnate Jesus. It's a tough doctrine, that one. Hebrews 7:3. Without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. And it's that verse that they use, but we're not going to go into that. Melchizedek was made like unto the Son of God. The Greek word translated as without descent means of unrecorded genealogy. It just means that we don't know who the mother and father of Melchizedek is. It's not recorded. The Hebrews or the Israelites were really, really good at recording down the genealogies, but with Melchizedek, it wasn't recorded, and so he's without mother and father not because he didn't have a mother and father. Uh, even Jesus had a mother. I know we say that God was his father and he didn't have a literal father in that sense, but even Jesus had a literal mother. So that would make Melchizedek even unique to Jesus as well, having literally no mother and father. That's just a very strange doctrine. But it just means that it wasn't recorded and nobody knows who his mother and father were. Now, the purpose of that verse is to actually show that Melchizedek remained a priest outside of the Levitical priesthood as well, given through the law, like the Son of God, who is the priest in the same way, a priest not according to the law. So Melchizedek was the priest, but he wasn't priest as the Levitical priests were as according to the law, and that's what that verse is about. Without going too deep into much detail into it, the author of Hebrews then uses the tithe of Abraham to demonstrate that the priesthood of Melchizedek is greater than the Levitical priesthood. They, the Levites, the Levitical priests who receive tithes from others according to the law, being in the loins of Abraham, paid the tithe to the high priest Melchizedek along with Abraham. Melchizedek, however, was a priest who did not come from that lineage, as we've already seen, of Levi, a priest not according to the law. But he received a tithe from Abraham, and then he blessed Abraham. Now, Jesus is not a priest according to the law, and I'm going to do a video on that as well at some point. He cannot be a priest according to the law. One, because the law is no longer, but also because Jesus was of Judah, and we've already seen in part one. Only the Levites could become priests. Anyone from Judah could not become a priest under the law. And now Jesus is referred to as a priest under the order of Melchizedek 7 times in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews 5:6, as he saith also in another place, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. 5:10, called of God and high priest after the order of Melchizedek. This is also in Hebrews 6:20, 7:11, 7:15, 7:17, and 7:21. Now, it's also, if we go back to the Psalm, into the Old Testament, it's also recorded in Psalm 110:4 as well. The Lord hath sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. This is a foretelling of the priesthood of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament in Psalm 110:4. Now, this fact is often used to support the tithe to Jesus. Jesus being a priest in the order of Melchizedek, meaning that the New Testament believers are required to tithe in the same way that Abraham was required to tithe to Melchizedek. And we are told that Abraham is the less, but he was blessed by the better in Hebrews 7:7. Simply another reference to Melchizedek being greater than Abraham. His priesthood was being greater than that which would come through Abraham, the Levitical priesthood. Then comes a verse that is used incorrectly, either by sheer ignorance or unfortunately by some deliberately trying to misguide it by many to prove that when we tithe here on earth, mortal men receive those tithes, but Jesus in heaven receives them. And that's Hebrews 7:8, as we've already looked at. The reference here in verse 8, though, is not men on earth in general, but referring solely to those in Jerusalem, where the tithe was offered. The men that die are the priests. They that are in Jerusalem who receive the tithes. The book of Hebrews is written to the Hebrews. There is no reference to Jesus and heaven in the verse at all, to imply that the he is Jesus and the there is heaven is to totally rip that verse out of context and apply a meaning that simply does not come from the text itself. It's a very clear case of a bad eisegesis, basically. There have only been 3 references in the preceding verses of chapter 7. So if you read chapter 7, there are only 3 references all the way through there up until this point. Abraham, the Levitical priests, and Melchizedek. He receiveth them is referring to the referent in verses 5 and 6 and 7, Melchizedek. The he is Melchizedek, and the there is where he received the tithe of Abraham. Hebrews 7 does not support tithing. Its purpose is to highlight that Jesus is greater than the Levitical priesthood. That although they are from Abraham, Melchizedek was greater than Abraham in the sense his priesthood superseded Abraham when Abraham gave him a tithe. And Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, as in a priesthood that is not derived from and is not derived and is greater than the Levitical priesthood, which came from Abraham, who was less than Melchizedek. Jesus, however, is the referent in verses 11 through 17, the law being compared to the new priest who is called after the order of Melchizedek, and not of that of Aaron through the law, Hebrews 7:11. If therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest should arise after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron? A change of priesthood requires a change of the law, Hebrews 7:12. For the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. This verse is one of the best verses to prove that the law has finished, by the way. For he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe, of which no man gave attendance at the altar. So this is the tribe. Another tribe is Judah, of which Jesus came from, as the next verse then says. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning the priesthood. Jesus, we are going to do this in a separate teach further on in the law, but Jesus could not be a priest if the law remained. He could not be our high priest. He is from Judah, and under the law, Jesus would not be allowed to be a priest. Jesus, being of the line of Judah and not Levi, doesn't qualify for being a priest. But Jesus, however, is not made priest by the law. The purpose of the passage again is to show that Jesus' priesthood is greater than the priesthood that came by the law. Jesus' priesthood is forever, unlike the Levitical priesthood, which came to an end when the law came to an end. Hebrews 7 cannot be used to support a New Testament tithe. We should also look at the actual tithe of Abraham himself, or what he actually tithed. And while it is very true that this incident with Abraham, where he gave a tenth, a tithe to Melchizedek, did happen approximately 1,000 years. It happened about 430 years before the law was given. It is incorrect and misleading simply to say that this was a tithe, and that this is proof that we must tithe 10% of our income today. When we look at the passage in context and apply understanding, we will see that they actually teach something completely different. So let's have a look at the tithe of Abraham. The first thing that we must notice is that Melchizedek suddenly shows up in Genesis 14. He is not mentioned before, and he doesn't get mentioned again, apart from one verse in Psalms 110, as we've already seen, where Jesus was, it was foreordained that Jesus would be a priest under the order of Melchizedek. That's the only other time in the whole of the Old Testament that Melchizedek is found. So let's go back and have a quick look. Genesis 14:17. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's dale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. Now, we are not told who he is or any other details about him, apart from that he is the king of Salem and that he is the priest of the Most High God. Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies unto thy hand, and he gave him tithes of all. However, if we apply the true understanding of the word tithe, what we actually see is that Abraham did not tithe, he simply gave a tithe, in terms that he gave a tenth. He gave 10% to Melchizedek. Now, what's really important to understand here is that there was no command to do so. It was not from God. It's not God's 10%. It's not the 10% of the land that we saw previously in the previous video. It wasn't holy. It's not God's 10%. It was Abraham just gave him 10% of what he had, which we'll see was 10% of the spoils of the war that Abraham had fought. It's ignorant or being deceptive to say that Abraham tithed to Melchizedek. A one-off tithe or a one-off giving of 10% is not tithing. We also see that, again, as we saw in the previous video, he gave the 10% after the already given blessing. Melchizedek blessed Abraham before Abraham gave him the tithe, exactly as we saw in the Old Testament, when under the law the Israelites would be blessed, and then they would give 10% of that blessing. And this is exactly what happens here. Genesis 14:18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram. This is Abram before Abraham became Abraham. Of the Most High God, professor of heaven and earth. It was after the giving of the blessing that Abraham gave the 10%, or gave the tenth. And it is also claimed by some that Abraham became wealthy after he was blessed. But yet again, this is incorrect. Abraham was already rich. before he gave a tithe to Melchizedek or received the blessing, which we find back in Genesis 13. Genesis 13:1. And Abraham went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the south. And Abraham was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. So Abraham was already rich. He wasn't made rich because he tithed. So anybody that tells you that Abraham became very, very wealthy after he gave his 10% because God blessed Abraham because of the tithing, and so you give your 10% and God will bless you. Again, they're just trying to get your money, and that's it. They're literally abusing the scripture in order to try and empty you of your pockets, your money, and it's really quite sad, and so many people fall for it. Abraham did not give any of his own personal possessions that he already possessed. He didn't give anything from his income. He didn't give anything from his produce of the land. Abraham was met by Melchizedek after Abraham returned from war, having gone to rescue his nephew Lot from captivity. Now, if we go back to verse 13 through 16, we will see that Abraham was successful in his war and brought with him goods, women, and the people or the spoils of the war. Genesis 14:13. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, the brother of Enar. And these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants born in his house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants, by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Hobah, which is in the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the women also, and the people. So, when we know the story of Lot being taken, Abraham went to rescue Lot, him and all of his servants. They won the war. They brought back Lot, and then they brought all of the spoil of the war. And it was the 10% of that Abraham gave. So, unlike what is often taught, Abraham did not give a tithe of everything that was his. It was only from the spoils of the war which Abraham gave 10% to Melchizedek. Now, what is also not stated by those using Abraham to support tithing is that Abraham, after he had provided for his men, actually gave all the remainder back to the king of Sodom. Genesis 14:21. And the king of Sodom said unto Abraham, give me the persons, and take the goods to thyself. And Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abraham rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Ener, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. None of the spoils of war belonged to Abraham. He gained them from the war. Now, Abraham, though, he didn't keep any of it. He didn't want the king, anybody to be able to say, or the king of Salem to say, that he had made Abraham rich. Now, if the story of Abraham teaches that we must tithe 10% of our income, it also teaches that we should give away the remainder of it to where we obtained it from. So, get your income, give 10% to the church, and then give the 90% back to the work that the company that you work for. If you want to follow Abraham's tithe, you want to tithe like Abraham did, that's exactly what you'll do, because that's what Abraham did. The tithe was not to support Melchizedek. It was not to support a church. It did not come from Abraham's personal possessions or any produce. It was not money. It was not a weekly, a monthly, or a yearly donation. It did not come from Abraham's income. And Abraham never repeated this again. It was from the spoils of war. And after Melchizedek had blessed him. After Melchizedek had recognized that Abraham's enemies had been delivered to him by God, as per verse 20. So, if we are to copy the Abrahamic tithe, and in the same way offer the tithe to Jesus, then we cannot forget tithing. We can forget tithing from our income. We simply give 10% of all that we obtain from war. So it's time to go to war, get our 10%, and we can give that to Jesus. And then we can give all the rest of it back to whoever we went to war with. As well as Abraham, some will also point to Jacob and say that he told God that if he was with him, he would give the Lord a tithe. And this also supports a pre-law tithe. But I'm going to show this incorrect as well. Now, it is true, again, that Jacob is before the law, because Jacob is Israel, basically. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and the law came through the Israelites. So Jacob is pre-law. Genesis 28:20. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee. So it is obviously claimed that this is showing, just like Abraham, Jacob tithed to God pre-law. However, when we put this into the context of where it's taken from, we will see that Jacob was actually was asking for God's blessings. If God was with him and would bless him, then he would offer a 10th. to God, not that he would give the tenth that was already God's, and that he would tithe. Genesis 28:18. And Jacob rose up early in the morning and took the stone that he had put for his pillows, and set it up for a pillar, and poured oil upon the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel. But the name of that city was called Luz at the first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set forth for a pillar shall be God's house, and all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth unto thee. What is clear to see is that Jacob offered to give God a tenth, not a tithe, under the law, or a tithe in the same way that Abraham gave to Melchizedek. If Jacob was required to give a tithe, then saying that if God would be with him, he would give a tithe would be rather pointless, because it would be a bit like if your landlord comes to collect their rent and you saying to them, well, I'll give you your rent if you provide some food and clothes for me. If the rent is due, it's due, regardless of any bargaining or offer on your part. You cannot bargain when something is owed, or if it's rightfully owed to the person. So Jacob wasn't saying, well, I'll give you your 10% only if you look after me. Well, if the 10% was to be given, it didn't make any difference. He had to give the 10%, but that's not what Jacob was saying to God. He stated that if God would be with him, then he would give 10%. He did not give a tithe. Now, Jesus himself is used to prove tithing as well, as he spoke of tithing in Matthew 23:23. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Again, there's a big however. This is the only mention that Jesus gave to tithes, and it was to condemn the scribes and Pharisees who were already paying the tithe. He said, you're hypocrites, for you paid the tithe. Now, notice as well that it was mint, anise, and cumin. This wasn't money. This was, again, produce. But they didn't hold to the weightier matters of the law, basically. So they gave their tithe. So there's no condemnation here of tithe, and it certainly wasn't money. Now, we also have to remember that the law was still in force at this time when Jesus was alive, before his death and resurrection. Now, even if it could be proved that Jesus taught tithing here, it would be pre-death and resurrection, and therefore would be under the law, which had not ended yet because Jesus hadn't died. With there now being no current Levitical priesthood, and the law has been changed, as has the priesthood, it must be asked, to whom are any of these tithes meant to be given? Now, advocates of the New Testament will say that they, as we said, they will take the tithes for Jesus. But we've already seen that under the law, the priests received the tithes, but we're not under the law, so we don't have to tithe to a priesthood. And in the New Testament, in the New Covenant, we are all priests. Revelation 1:6. And hath made us kings and priests unto God and his Father. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. Now, we're not Levitical priests, so we can't receive tithes because we're not we're not under the law. So this cannot be used to say that you must tithe to the priests. Well, we're all priests, so we'll all tithe to one another. And that's the thing. We're meant to look after one another. It's not about giving tithes to the pastor. Now, even though the New Testament believer is not required to tithe, this does not mean that the New Testament believer is not required to give. Nowhere, if you've watched the two videos, nowhere have I said that a New Testament believer shouldn't give. In fact, we should give. But we don't tithe, and there's a difference. Paul tells us that we should sow. 2 Corinthians 9:6. But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. However, if we again don't simply take this verse alone and actually put the verse into context, we will see Paul explains what this means in the very next verse. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not begrudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. Every man should give according to his own heart, not grudgingly. You don't. So I know that people give their 10% to church and they don't like doing it. But they go to church, the church tells them that they have to give the 10%, they give their 10%. But it's not, as Paul stated, not through necessity. God loves a giver who gives through his own heart. Something echoed by Peter, 1 Peter 5:2. Feed the flock of God which is among you. Take the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for a filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. The Greek there means greedily. Don't do it greedily. You're not giving for what you can get. That so many people give their 10% because they want that tenfold or hundredfold back. That's not what God wants. God doesn't want you to give because of what you're going to get back from it. You're meant to give because you want to give. You're in Christ. Your heart tells you to give. But that doesn't mean that you go out and you spend 100% of your wage or 10% of your wage or whatever. You give when you feel the need to give to somebody. Now, Jesus explained this in the parable of the sheep and the goats. Then shall, in Matthew 25:34, then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and ye clothed me. I was sick, and ye visited me. I was in prison, and ye came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee hungered and fed thee, or thirsty and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger and took thee in, or naked and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick or in prison and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, insomuch as you have done it unto of the least of these, my brethren, ye have also done it to me. So here it was giving food and giving somebody, they're thirsty, you give them a drink. When they're in need, you look after them when they're sick. You visit them when they're in prison, and you help them. That's tithing. That's a New Testament tithe. It doesn't have to be money. It can be time. You can give somebody. You can sit down with somebody that needs to have a chat, and you can talk to somebody. That's your tithe. That's a New Testament tithe. It's a giving. There is no tithe for the New Testament believer. There is only a giving, which should be one with a willing heart, and not simply in order to receive something back. It does not have to be financial. It can be, if that's what you feel. The Old Testament tithe, under the requirement of the law, has been replaced with the New Testament giving, which comes under grace. Okay, so that's basically it for tithing. If you've enjoyed this study, maybe you've missed part one, go back and watch part one. I thank you very much for listening. I'll see you on another video. Please give this a thumbs up, and if you haven't, please subscribe. It really does help, and it will help to get the message out to other people who are being basically abused in the system, where they are being forced to pay a tithe that they don't want to, or maybe they can't even afford to do. If you can't afford to give 10% of your wage, why would you give it? If it means that you struggle, why would you do that? There's so many other ways that you can help someone. If you have plenty of money, don't stop at 10%. If you want to tithe as much as you can. That's fine. Help. But don't do it because you're going to get something back from it. Do it because you see somebody and you think, I'd like to help them. Okay. Thank you very much for watching. Shalom.